more of a physical thing, I'll tend to watch a YouTube video on how to do it. Like, go on a tutorial and then, okay, all right, let me try that again. Okay, let me check a different tutorial. All right, now I got it.
Totally. Or if I'm following a set of instructions and I'm getting it, like if it's a new thing I bought, like, all right, I'm following these, I'll keep reading. But once I get to a point where I'm like, this is too much stuff, I can't take it all in, then I stop and I just, like, I'll figure it out as I go along. The Tribes of Babel Podcast.
Nice.
And as you know, I wanted to talk about basically the interplay between language and identity and sense of, who you are.
Right.
So could you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Well, I'm no expert in the topic or anything. I do live a life that is bilingual. My name is Kevin, and I am an English teacher in Japan at a school for the Korean minority population. So in my job, I sit in meetings that are conducted in Korean and in Japanese, never in English.
I think that's already a super interesting kind of community that probably a lot of people, even in Japan, are unaware of.
Right. It's true. And the fact that it is to the point that I actually end up needing a bit of a decompression after I leave work, because I find myself, for example, when I go to the convenience store, saying "감사합니다" to the person behind the counter, because I've spent all day in this sort of like Korean immersion.
Yeah, I could totally see that.
And I don't really speak Korean, honestly, but because of the greetings and just sort of the day-to-day things that you say to one another are all conducted in that language where I work. And then I leave and I'm in yet a different language until I get home.
Yeah, it's funny that greetings and stuff like that, like saying thank you or hello or goodbye, like even without speaking a language at all, those are like the first things you can learn.
Right.
And they're the things you get to use all the time. So you cannot know 99% of a language and yet speak it, so to speak, all the time. Whoops. In the sense of like greet people in it and thank people in it without knowing how to say anything else.
Oh, exactly.
So, yeah.
Well, and in fact, one clear example of that is, I don't know, I'm sure your Japanese has improved quite a bit since you've been in Japan, but when you first came here, I don't know what your Japanese level was, but you probably noticed right away that taxi drivers were always amazed at how good your Japanese was. And I finally told someone once, I was like, it's not that my Japanese is good. It's really not. It's just that every taxi driver asks me the same questions. We have the same conversation.
Yeah.
And I've gotten really good at that conversation.
Yeah.
And so it's true. If you watched me talking to a taxi driver 10 years ago, you would have thought like, man, that guy's Japanese is really good. It was not. But my taxi ride Japanese was really, really on fleek.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. I could totally see that. I hadn't thought about taxi drivers specifically, but I think there's a lot of conversations. I think speaking a second language or living in a country where your native language is not the dominant language really shows you how many conversations in life are repetitive, are the same conversation over and over and over.
Right.
I think sometimes in your native language, you're not as aware of, hey, I've only used the same 36 words all day today, or
right.
again and again this week. But you really notice it when it's the second language.
I also think that was one of the things that hit me with reverse culture shock when I went home, was that I felt like my day-to-day life was like suddenly going back and playing at the beginning level of a video game.
How so?
So, okay, for example, one thing that happened to me when I'd first gone back is I needed to rent a car from the airport. And I remember sitting there. I sat down in the chair at the airport there in front of the rental counter. And I was going over for a moment, like all the vocabulary I would need. And I went to pull out my book before I realized, and I was there for like 3 minutes thinking about things I needed to say before I realized, oh, wait, this is all in my language. I don't need to worry about this at all. And I was like, oh, well, that's just, why did I ever have trouble with anything before? Like once I had gone home, just like everything was just so easy.
Yeah, I totally understand. I think especially with dealing with the bureaucratic concerns, like you have to do a lot of stuff when you're living in a foreign country, like renew your visa or fill out paperwork that is inherently unpleasant, no matter where you do it, even in your own language, and you're adding to that like a second language. And plus, I think if you're coming from a Western country and you're in Japan, there's also the fact that this is one of the most complex languages to read. I think even compared to, I have friends that are Chinese or speak Chinese that say, even Chinese, even though it's all kanji, but it's not called kanji, but it's all that Chinese character system, each character just has one sound. Whereas in Japanese, there's 3 written systems.
Right.
And they're all read differently depending on the context. So, you're adding a language that's difficult to read in the spectrum of human languages, and it's your second language, and you're dealing with like bureaucratic legalese.
Right.
So that's a giant headache. And then you're right. Yeah. Every time I've gone back home and I have to go to like the DMV or I've had to go to like the embassy for something and I fill out some forms in English, I'm like, man, this is like Nerf bureaucracy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and two, I mean, the thing that you're not even mentioning that Japanese adds just an extra layer of difficulty to with is that they have a separate word for every single one of those forms and every single one of those actions for doing those forms that we don't have.
And how formal you're being.
Right.
Legalese, English legalese is not even that complicated compared to like Japanese, like Sonkeigo legalese.
Right. But not even Keigo. Like, like your students will may ask you, you're like, well, how do you say Inchaku Shomeisho in English? And just, that's the letter from the station.
Yeah.
Well, how would you say, like, Shindansho? Well, that's just your letter from the doctor.
Doctor's note.
Yeah, doctor's note. You can say letter from the doctor or doctor's note, and everyone's going to understand. Right. But if you,
Yeah, because we tend to do that when we speak Japanese, right? Before you know the correct word, you go like, Isha-san kara no tegami.
Right. Right. And they have no idea what... They're like, well, good for you. What did he tell you?
The doctor wrote you a letter? Really? Are you guys like friends? Or Yeah. And that's a really good point.
Yeah.
I was thinking about it with diseases because obviously coronavirus has been in the news and stuff lately.
Right.
And also Yuki gets an upset stomach a lot.
Uh-huh.
And when I first encountered a lot of diseases here, like something N at the end.
Right.
Which the N is the equivalent of like itis in English. It basically means inflammation, which I think is the exact same thing that itis means in Greek or Latin or whatever it is. But ichoen is basically what we would call a stomach flu.
Right.
But I, for the longest time, didn't make that connection because when I looked up ichoen and I saw the kanji, I was like, oh, it's like the stomach and the intestine are inflamed.
Right.
And when you look what that is in English, it's gastroenteritis because gastro stomach, right? Enter is the...
But it is intestine. Not gastroenteritis.
Well, to doctors it is.
I guess. Well, that's the other thing too. You're right.
Right.
Sorry to interrupt you, but the other thing about that is when you end up trying to look for the word that is the I guess this is probably what you're saying. You end up getting the medical term that nobody knows.
Exactly. Well, I mean, literally, like ichoen and gastroenteritis are exactly correct, but it's like in terms of understanding.
Right.
When I read gastroenteritis, it sounded a lot more serious than the stomach flu. Once I made the connection, I was like, oh, this is just the technical name for the stomach flu, and then.
Is it? I thought it was a different thing.
I thought so too, but apparently not. Yeah.
Oh.
If you go to like my trick is I go to Wikipedia in one language and then I change the language to another, and it goes from like the Japanese Wikipedia to the English Wikipedia. It's better than a dictionary for stuff like that.
I ended up doing it reverse. So like I'll look it up, find it, and then like Google that word, Google the English word in English to find out what it is.
Yeah, a lot of online language searches are machine translated too. So it's, at least with the Wikipedia page, you know that like this is the page for speakers of that language, and these two pages have been deemed by the Wikipedia community to be like equivalent to each other. Smart. And you can even see if they have some of the same photos or the same like section content breakdown or whatever. But anyway, the point I was trying to make is that it just. Like you were saying about Shindansho and Doctor's Note, is that you sometimes the word is not the word.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
So it was around. As soon as I got to the point, I was like, wait, that's all I'm trying to say. It didn't take that much.
Well, and also like something I've discovered in Japan is that they have specific verbs for things that we in English just don't have specific verbs for. And it doesn't affect me as much, because in this particular instance, I think they can usually know what you mean. But oftentimes my students, for example, if they're writing something, they're like, but what's the word for that? It's put. No. I'm talking about when you put this thing on this thing. Like, what's that verb? Still put. It's just put.
Well, yeah, I mean,
it's going to be put no matter what you're putting where.
I think that goes both ways, though.
Yeah.
Because where the languages delineate, like, what's specific. You know what I always find funny, if you really want to frustrate a student with something that they really don't need to know at all, is just go like, yeah, in English, every animal baby has its own name. It's not a dog baby or a cat baby, because in Japanese, right, it's koinu, koneko,
right,
kohitsuji, like everything's just ko plus the animal name,
except for wild boars.
Oh, what are they called?
Uribo.
Oh, I did not know that they're uribo. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, but in English we have different one for every animal. Plus, like the group of animals, a herd versus a flock versus a
right,
and it's all this complexity that when you look at from a Japanese perspective, and they're like, why isn't it just horse group?
Yeah.
And fish group. Like, why is it a school? And then you really think about it, you're like, why isn't, I don't know.
A murder of crows.
A murder of crows, yeah.
Sounds cool, though.
Yeah, it does sound cool. And then, meanwhile, like, when I was learning Japanese, I always remember, there's like several instances where I have the same memory of having the same reaction. One was I asked my Japanese friend in junior high school, who's actually the first person that, like, brought me to Japan to stay with his family when I was a kid. I remember asking him once, how do you say yes and no in Japanese? And he said, "Oh, that depends on the situation." And I was like, "What?
What?
How can yes and no depend? Like, how do you get any more simple than those concepts?" And he's like, "Well, it depends if you're saying like yes, I agree, or you're answering a question, yes or no,
right?
Or you're like." And I just like as soon as I heard it, I was like, "I don't want to learn Japanese. I'm immediately not interested anymore," because it's like that's upsetting to take a concept that feels like it ought to be. Okay, I can at least learn these two words real quick.
Right.
Or same thing with like when I asked, how do you say I and you?
Yeah, right.
And you have that
well, it depends, doesn't it?
Yeah. Who are you and who are you talking to?
I'm not even I anymore? Right. Like, talk about being lost in another language, right?
Right. And for anyone who doesn't know Japanese, who might be listening or doesn't know much about Japanese, that we're not talking about like subject-object, like I, me.
Right.
Or him, his, so what am I saying? He, him. We're not saying that difference. There's like actually, depending on like the social hierarchy of the situation you're in and the tone you want to have and your personality, it's a different word, yeah. And
also, just when you can use you. Like, you is, I is very difficult. And you makes I look simple.
Yeah. Yes. Right. When is it acceptable to, like, for example, if you're in a business situation and you're talking to a customer, you can't even really say anata, which is like the most polite word. You have to say okyakama.
Right.
You have to refer to them as customer.
Right. You have to refer to them as the customer, or at least if it's a teacher, at least you can call them sensei. But like oftentimes, if it's just someone you've met, then you need to, instead of you put their name in there.
Right.
So I would be, so what did Ian do yesterday?
Yeah.
Well, looking at your face and talking to you directly.
Right.
It's like you're always talking about someone in the third person.
Right, exactly.
Which sucks if you're really bad at remembering people's names that you just met.
Well, you know what's actually really funny about that is I'm sure you've seen or been in this situation. Like, what I found really interesting is the way people deal with not knowing someone's name. Like in English, you might be in the middle of a conversation and you need to use someone's name and you realize like you didn't get it.
Right.
But it's early enough in meeting them that you can say that.
Right.
You can acknowledge it. So in English, I think what we usually do is go like, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, or I'm sorry, what was your name again, or something like that.
Right.
In Japanese, it's almost like because the name is used as like the subject of the sentence, and because of word order, it's usually the first word you need to say.
Right.
So sometimes you just see people go like, they just I can't even do it on audio, but they just sort of freeze and go. And the other person will register what they mean and be like, "Oh, it's Takeshi." Like,
yeah. And that's true. And I guess those nonverbal cues are up there with, we talked about earlier about how comedy is one of the things at the end of what you can learn. I think nonverbal cues are in there as well. Like there's certain nonverbal cues that it just takes you a long time to learn.
Yeah.
And it works both ways too. often, well, for example, when you're introducing yourself in English, when you first meet somebody, you tend to not say, "What's your name?" You tend to say, like, "Oh, I'm Kevin," and then you stick out your hand.
Right.
And then Japanese people will say, "Oh, nice to meet you," and shake your hand.
Yeah, right.
And then you have trapped them in your hand, and you're not letting them go until they say their name.
Right.
Like subconsciously, you're just like, you've got their hand, and they're like, why is he still holding my hand?
Yeah. It's a fundamental breakdown at like the most basic level, because I've had the handshake reaction. I've also had it where you stick your hand out and you get they realize that you're prompting them for something, and they just go, yes.
Yeah, right.
I'm Ian, and you stick
Fair
your hand,
enough.
and they look at your hand, look at you, and go, yes. Nice to meet you. Which is funny because I picture it from their perspective. They're seeing you introduce yourself and then stick out your hand and be like, "No, you acknowledge that I've said something."
Right. Yeah. But it does. But like they don't take the next step of, and I should probably introduce myself too.
Right.
Yeah. But it's true. Like they don't have that verbal or the nonverbal cue.
Yeah, this is a good chance for a segue, because it makes me think of how a lot of those nonverbal cues. I think oftentimes when you learn something, once you know it, you forget the process of learning. You forget the moments that you learn. Some things you remember, but especially in childhood.
Right.
I think most adults in the world are not aware of how much of our language use, our social cues, just comes from being like 2 years old and having your mom like poke you in the back and be like, "Now introduce yourself," or like, "Now you say something," or "Now you say thank you," like
right.
Or you say like I'm trying to think of a sentence that I thought of something recently where I saw a situation and it made me think of that, but like a 2-year-old being like, "I can has milk now," and you're like, "I can have milk
now,"
and that's just done to you as a child, and you're so not aware of it that you're basically like a dog being trained, right? You get what you want every time you say it correctly,
right? And
you get like applauded if you use the right etiquette, and so that sticks. And then when you're adult, you just feel like you just always knew it,
right? Well, here's another thing where you're right. I actually have a special window into this because I have a tiny human in my home right now who is growing up in a bilingual environment.
Great, yeah, and this is a great subject to get into.
So my youngest son, David, is growing up with his mom, whose native language is Japanese, and me, whose native language is English, mainly. Main language is English. And now I will tell you, my wife's English is head and shoulders above my Japanese. But we have tried to maintain a bilingual home that he can learn in. And so her and I almost entirely communicate in English. So he sees people speaking English to each other. And we have, sort of curated that for him.
Is that morning and night every day?
Every day, okay. Morning and night. That's right. And because her and I both work, but she's a nurse, and so her schedule is not a Monday through Friday schedule. So oftentimes on the weekends, those are his daddy days, and those are all English days. And I'm amazed that such a tiny little person who can't yet figure out how to use a toilet can watch a television screen and tell you if he can't read it, but he can tell you if it's Japanese or English.
That's interesting.
He can look at it and go, "Daddy, Japanese. Like if the subtitles, like I will switch the subtitles to English because apparently I have ADD now and I need to be able to read. And so when my wife Kanako is at home, I will actually switch the subtitles to English. And he's figured that out. And so like if we have something on television and there's still Japanese subtitles, he'll run over and point to the screen and say, "Daddy, Japanese." And then he'll say, "English." And I'll switch it to English. He can't read it, but he knows which one is which.
Does he do that just on daddy days, or does he do it also if it's both you and Kana in the house? Or?
He will. Well, he always points out, like if there's anything written, he will point out whether it's Japanese or English.
Oh, either way, he'll point out.
Yeah, whether it's the back of his juice box or whatever.
That's super interesting to me, and what immediately came to mind listening to that is if he's that aware of it, that he's always like verbalizing it,
right?
He must be picking up on patterns that like, oh, when Dad watches TV, he uses English subtitles.
He
and
does.
When Mom watches TV, she uses Japanese subtitles.
Not only that, like he has figured out, I will tell you that if he were to meet an Asian American, it would throw him.
Yeah.
Because right now, what he sees is when he sees Asian people, he speaks Japanese to them. And when he sees anybody who's not Asian, no matter, or not Japanese, really, whatever they are, he speaks to them first in English.
This is, I think, an extremely familiar aspect of living in Asia.
Right.
That is a lot less controversial here than it is, for example, in the United States.
Oh, for sure.
To just racially profile somebody and decide what language you're going to speak to them. And kind of nobody freaks out. I mean, some people that are a little bit hypersensitive will either way. Like, I've had the frustrating experience where I'm speaking Japanese to somebody, but because my face looks how my face is, they're trying to answer in English.
Right.
Despite the fact that it's clear it's not necessary. And, there is a bit of frustration that builds up, but I just think if it were the 21st century US, I might freak out. I'm not saying me personally, like, I don't want to do that. I don't think that's a good way to handle it, but someone in my situation might freak out and society might completely be on their side. If I was to stand there and be like, this is racist, and why aren't you speaking to me in Japanese? If you take people's life experiences, like you look at how your son's growing up, it's totally understandable.
Right.
That's what he's seen.
Right. And, to be fair, he's 2.
Excellent point.
I feel like those particular subtleties of society are something he can figure out later.
Sure.
But it's very fascinating to watch him. When I take him, he has a baby gym class. And when I take him to the baby gym class, he will pick up so they throw the little plastic balls all over the floor for the kids to go pick up. And they're all different colors because, kids. And so he goes and he picks up the red one, for example, and he'll come over and he'll say, Daddy, red one. And he will turn around to his teacher and say, Akaino. Like on the spot. And he even will say, and like this, so that happened. That's an actual thing that happened, and his teacher commented on it. And he said to her, Daddy, eigo kara. And then he turned around to me and said, Daddy, English. And so he's literally he's at 2 already. He knows that that's the person that he speaks Japanese to. Said, Daddy, English in Japanese to her, and then turned around to me and said, Daddy, English. As if I couldn't understand what he had said to her.
I'm really glad you shared that story, and that's the kind of stuff I would love to hear more about, because there was one specific. So Yuki and I had a conversation that gave me the idea for I want to do a podcast about this, because I've not seen anybody really get into it. And then we had one experience right after that where I was like, I got to do this.
Yeah.
Because we're thinking this year to try to have a kid, and it's something that I want to be conscious of going in to have a child and not get too caught off guard. I'm sure it will be caught off guard, but we went. I think it was. I don't remember who was hosting it, but you remember we went for that picnic on the river in Nakanoshima.
Yeah.
There was a big group of people, and
there were a bunch of kids.
Yeah, and it started raining, and there's the kids running around, and there was a pair of kids. I don't want to say people's names before they've been on here and sort of signed the release.
I actually wouldn't be able to tell you their names, to be honest with you, but I do remember. I know exactly what you're talking about, because there were these kids who were not toddlers like the other kids there. No. They were not like babies and toddlers. Right. They were.
It was maybe like a 5-year-old girl and like a 7-year-old boy.
Right.
Maybe a couple years younger than that, but in that range. And the boy was kicking a soccer ball around, and we kind of went and kicked the ball around with him for a while, because I remember being a child, because I was the oldest child, and being like the only kid my age when the adults got together, and kind of being stuck between two worlds. So whenever I see a kid in that position,
this is the worst, being the oldest by far kid at the kids table.
Exactly. Yeah. So I always try to give them the 20 minutes of I'll kick soccer ball with them and ask them, what they're into, and just so they don't feel completely left out of the adult world. But so Yuki and I went and played with these kids, and it was interesting because I saw the older brother processing us. Mm-hmm. He was going these. So this couple, obviously one person's, again, he probably just racially profiled us, which is totally normal for a kid. That's what he's seen and what he's used to. But then he also was but they're code switching. He was seeing us code switch with ourselves and being wait, so which is the language they use?
Right.
And then he said to both of us separately, because I heard him say it to Yuki when I was out of earshot. 'Cause she was speaking to him in English because it was like Sunday and that's our English day between the two of us. He said to Yuki, he's like, you can speak Japanese to me. He said it in Japanese. He's like, 全然日本語喋ってもいいよ。僕わかるから. And I was like, that's interesting.
Right.
By the way, that's,
I actually remember that.
Yeah.
I remember him saying that because either that or I heard him say it to somebody else who was also speaking. But I think it might have been Yuki.
Well, that's the thing is he said it also to me. So he must have said it to other people as well. This kid was really tuned into the fact that some people, even if they can speak 2 languages, by the way, if you're hearing that on mic, we're not farting. There's like a drill or construction happening somewhere.
It's funny because I was like, you could turn off your phone. You don't have to let it keep rumbling over there.
Yeah, no, there's construction happening, I think, in the building. But so this kid was really tuned into the fact that like people, like even if they can speak 2 languages, some people are more comfortable in one, and he was trying to make people feel comfortable.
Right.
And like I can speak whichever language you want, which I thought was very interesting, and why I think your story about your are you using his name?
Yeah, I said David. His name.
Okay. I didn't want to out him. Interesting about David is
don't tell people you're my dad. Jeez.
You're gonna
use my name. Just don't say you're my dad.
You're gonna get a lawsuit.
It's gonna be embarrassing later.
But the interesting story about him and his teacher, or the interesting thing about that story is it's the same thing, and it's a great example. Both of those stories are great examples of there's a statistic that children who grow up actively bilingual actually learn empathy sooner.
Right.
And they learn it better than other kids. Not that monolingual people are not empathetic. It's just the way they learn the lesson is that I can speak 2 languages and some people can't. That's a really different lesson than a monolingual kid can learn.
Right. And also, think about this as somebody who didn't grow up that way, like me and you and most people. When you were little, adults seemed infallible. Mm-hmm. To at that early an age figure out that they're not.
You can do something that
that they can't.
Yeah.
And that there's something they can't do, even though the situation requires it in some cases. And you can. That is such a kind of a gift of a thing to learn.
Totally.
For a small child.
Totally. I mean, like this is a bit of a dark comparison, but what it makes me think of is how if you look at kids who come from sort of broken homes where like a parent's dealing with like drug addiction or mental illness, you see kids grow up faster because they realize oh, mom or dad can't take care of himself or herself. I've got to do some things that mom or dad can't do. But in a less destructive or without involving illness, you have the same thing with language where the kid is able to go, oh, like dad can't navigate this situation because he doesn't speak Japanese, or mom doesn't have the English for this situation, but I do.
Right.
That's a powerful thing, as you say, that casts adults in a totally different light. And I think probably not only building empathy, but it probably is good for self-confidence, I would think.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Exactly. So, could you imagine? I mean, imagine having that when you were 6 years old or 7 years old. Could you imagine what it would have been like if like you were with a group of people and you were the one that was like, hang on, grown-ups, I think I got this for you.
Dad, just go have a seat. I'll work this out for you.
Yeah, you know what? I'll order the food for everybody.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So how old's David?
He's 2.
Okay.
2 and a half.
You said 2.
And or more than 2 and a half.
Is he going to any kind of like daycare or anything like that yet?
He is, but his daycare was not chosen because this is going to be something that is a great international daycare. His daycare was chosen because it is connected to his mother's work. Okay. And so like he's not getting any English in it at all.
Well, so this connects to another thing that I want to talk about is that I think as people who are, I don't know how you define your class, but you define yourself, but like middle class, or we're aspiring to sort of curate our lives and curate our children's lives, and which is a privilege to be able to do, right? If there's people who are in economic situations where they can't even afford to think about that stuff, But I think there's a lot of us who think like, oh, I would like my child to do ballet, and I would like my child to speak English this well and speak Japanese this well. And those of us who are able to do that, I think we often feel guilt.
Right.
And I'm feeling it preemptively. I don't even have a child yet, but I'm like, man, I'm not going to be able to afford international school and all.
Right.
You know? And there's a lot of experiences that I would like them to have. I would like them to like split their year between the U.S. and Japan, but like, you know, that takes money.
Right. It does.
Right.
A lot.
Right. And then, you know, I was also thinking about, for me, even though, and I'll get into this maybe now or maybe in another podcast, but for me, my relationship with like Spanish and having a parent from Mexico was a sort of belated realization as far as like how I felt about myself and my identity. I don't want to get too sidetracked to talking about me, but just the gist of it is, as a child growing up in Southern California and passing for white, like if I don't tell people I'm half Mexican, like almost nobody suspects it. That's even language I use.
Suspect.
Well, but and that's what I'm getting at. Is there was a kind of privilege to being like, when I want to be, I can just be like, I'm one of the white kids. I don't know any Spanish. And it's unfortunate because I think English in Japan is a high status second language. It's cool to speak English,
right?
Even though a lot of people don't bother because it's difficult and they you know, until their job tells them you have to learn English. A lot of people just don't put much effort into studying. But the image of it is cool,
right?
Whereas like I think Spanish for Americans is a cool language to learn. It's not so cool to grow up speaking. It's not as cool depending on who you're around. Right.
I suppose that's true. Yeah, but definitely. And I think also depending on where you are, I think I remember at an early age seeing one of my classmates speaking Spanish. It was actually the first time I had a window into what we were talking about earlier with, you know, like the bilingual kids and like that sort of superpower they had. And one of my classmates, I was in second grade and one of my classmates spoke Spanish and I was like, whoa. So for me, I did not have that feeling at all. I just thought that was like a special ninja superpower.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that you're probably not the only person by a long stretch who felt that way about it as a kid and who feels that way about it now. But I mean, it goes in and out of being a hot button political issue, and certainly right now it's kind of at its peak or one of the peaks. But it does. I was cognizant as a child of being like, sometimes it's better to just pretend I have nothing to do with Mexico. The only relationship I had to do with Mexico.
Yeah.
And I don't mean like in a horrible, you know, there wasn't like violence enacted upon me for it, you know. Thankfully, obviously, that probably some people have experienced that, but
right.
But anyway, so I kind of took a long detour there. I'm trying to remember where I was going. But yeah, as far as how you define what the language means to you and in your life, sorry, maybe I'll come back to my train of thought. But I was trying to set up the idea that there can be high status languages and low status languages. Maybe in Japan, I would imagine a lot of Zainichi Koreans have a similar relationship with being able to speak Korean or having a Korean parent at home.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Well. Because of where I work, I have learned quite a bit of the Korean experience in Japan, and I mean I know a lot about. I wouldn't say I know a lot about, but I've learned, and as a member of the school that I work with, they kind of, I don't want to use the word indoctrinate, but it's the best word in the situation. They sort of indoctrinate their new employees into the culture, and we have to take classes on what happened to the Korean population and why the Korean population is as big as it is now, compared to pre-Meiji, and it's shocking. It is shocking how much their language was used against them. So there was a very dark period for the listeners that don't know. There was a very, very dark period in Japan where, fascism swept through Japan, and the brunt of that fascism was the Korean population and the Chinese population as well. now, like what I've learned about mostly is the Korean population. What they would do, there were already Korean people living in Japan.
The countries are right next door for anybody who geography is not. I mean, it's the closest country to Japan.
Right. So there were already Korean people living in Japan when this took effect, and when the Meiji period happened, and modernity ended up leading to fascism, and they started with making lists. They started with keeping track. And then it got worse from there. And they would go around, and Korean people living in Japan kind of got wise to it and stopped admitting that they were Korean. But they spoke with Korean accents. And one of the things that the sort of Japanese equivalent of the Gestapo would do when they would come around and try to find out if you were Korean is they would hold out a 50 yen coin or a 5 yen coin, and they would ask you to say it. What is this? So in the Korean language, the CH sound and the J sound are often interchangeable.
Probably also the G and the J, or G and the K sound.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And so oftentimes Korean people speaking Japanese, instead of saying, so the word for 10 in Japanese is ju. And that very easy. So they put that after each number in order to. So it's
20
like
is niju,
right? 20 is niju. 30 is sanju, and then 50 is goju, and especially with that G at the beginning. So oftentimes in Korean, so goju, but in Korean, oftentimes the G sound at the beginning is going to be a harder sound, right? You think like the G sound and the K sound your mouth is doing the same thing.
Go versus ko.
Right? Your mouth is doing the same thing. It's whether you've added a voice to it or not. I always think of it as like, so in Japanese, they have this little mark that sort of looks like one quotation mark.
Yeah.
And they attach that to the character to tell you whether or not it's going to have a voice or not.
Right.
So for Korean people, they have a really difficult time with that. If it's at the beginning if it's at the beginning of the word, they will often put a stress on it by not putting a voice on it.
Right.
And likewise, they will end up putting a voice on something that doesn't necessarily have it.
Right.
And so if it's in the middle of a word. So they would put this coin out and they would say, what is this? And it's goju-en.
That's the Japanese pronunciation.
That's the correct. If somebody had said like kochu-en or gochu-en,
right.
then they were like, aha. Right. And they ended up investigating it. But that was there. So they would come and knock on the doors and come in and they would say, sit down and talk with us. And then they would just like in their conversation, they would put that coin on the table and they would ask the person to say it for them. And if they didn't pass the test, then they ended up, in camps.
It's I didn't know that particular story. Thanks for sharing that. That's something that's a very good perspective to have given, your experiences where you work and stuff. And I think that history is important to know. I mean, you use the word indoctrinate and I understand your hesitance to use it, but I think that there is a certain, there's some concepts I wish we were less afraid of, right? That indoctrination isn't necessarily brainwashing.
Right.
That it's sometimes to understand where someone is coming from, you need to be explained. You need to have a bunch of stuff explained to you. Right. That you didn't know. It doesn't mean like you're now gonna like march in lockstep with whatever anyone from that group tells you. Right. It just means you didn't know some stuff and you need some important context. I didn't know that story, but that practice, it's one of those stories I'm surprised to hear because I didn't know it. And it seems like I should have heard it by now. But at the same time, I'm not surprised because that practice, that test is a super ancient test. And it's been involved in, I don't want to exaggerate. I was going to say almost every, but it's been involved in many, many genocides and ethnic cleansings and atrocities throughout history. Have you heard that in other contexts?
Sure, of course. Well, I mean, it's also been used for good. I mean, the word shibboleth.
Right, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, it's called a shibboleth.
Right, it comes from a test to see if somebody was
I think it's biblical, right?
Right.
The Hebrews and the Assyrians, or I may be getting the specific groups wrong, but one group said Shibboleth and the other group said Sibboleth.
That's right.
And then, they would ask them, and what was it actually? I think it's
I don't remember.
it might a unit of measurement or possibly even money. Also,
Right.
It was some item that they would ask them to pronounce, and if you said this word, you lived,
Right.
and if you said this word, you died. Also, Haiti and the Dominican Republic had it with, I believe in that case it was because that island, half of it was colonized by Spain and half of it was colonized by France.
Right.
And because they're in such close proximity to the U.S., it is Haiti and Dominican Republic. They're on the same island, right? I hope I'm not getting that wrong. But they also...
We can edit that out.
So they also speak
course you
English.
do that.
And I think the word was the English word parsley. Because it was an English word that everybody knew that was not native to French or Spanish, and they would ask them to say parsley, and the Spanish people would roll their R, and the French people would do the sort of
Right.
pars. I can't do it, right? Obviously, right? But depending, I would I would not pass the test. But depending on which word they said, you were obviously Haitian or Dominican. Which it's such an... I think what's so insidious about the Shibboleth test is that It specifically, it almost like by its very nature, it acknowledges that you're not really that different.
Right.
You don't look different. Your ideology is not necessarily different. There's nothing about you that's so inherently different that you're like, I'm not saying that it's justified to have a genocide if you do look different, but I'm just saying that you have to actually catch someone on what's essentially a technicality.
Right. But, I mean... Well, what I was saying is that it hasn't always been used for evil. It has also been used, like, for example, by secret Christians. Like when Christians were being persecuted, they would often use that. They would often use a shibboleth to find each other.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
So in fact, the secret Christians in Kyushu, in Nagasaki, they had... Indo Shusaku has written a lot about them. They had a shibboleth as well to find each other.
That's interesting. So you're talking about basically symbols that the general population doesn't understand.
Right.
Okay.
In fact, the Jesus fish, that was the whole thing, right? Like that Jesus fish, what it comes from is, you draw one side, and if the person knows it, they draw the other side.
Right. I was familiar with that. So that's interesting because I'd never put those two concepts together. I didn't realize that was also called a shibboleth.
Maybe it's not. I don't know. But I mean, but it's the same kind of thing. It's
definitely.
I mean, if it's not, it could be.
Crypto identity.
Right.
Yeah. So that's very interesting. So I think that I would maybe separate the two because, and now I'm just sort of, what am I saying? Conjecturing. I don't know if they are the same concept or not, but it seems like to me, the shibboleth in the terms of what we're talking about with like the Japanese secret police and Koreans,
right,
or the Haiti Dominican Republic situation is it's something that the general population knows that the speaker can't really fully control.
Right.
Because obviously, if you were like...
it's a test against you.
Right.
Versus a test to let you in.
Right. And some people can code switch even their accent and dialect, right? Like,
oh, for sure.
And I think that when, like in our case, living abroad, you probably adjust the way you speak when you're in your hometown versus when you're speaking to like British people in Japan.
Oh, I grew up, I didn't grow up in the Seattle area. I grew up in Indiana, in Indianapolis.
Okay.
And I was in the city, and I went to, like intercity schools in Indianapolis. And that's from junior high. That's where I was. And as a result, like the dialect that I grew up speaking was, words and word choices I would make often sounded what would traditionally be African American. And I find but I am not. I am as pasty white as a NPR tote bag. But that's how I spoke growing up.
Right.
And now, because when you are with other people that speak the dialect that you grew up speaking, you code into that dialect. And it's incredibly insensitive for me to code into that dialect.
Right.
You know what I mean? I have to actively keep myself from doing that because white people that sound like that just sound like assholes. And I have to actively stop myself from doing that.
Yeah, it's funny because I have now, not something I had as a child, but now I have the reverse problem where living in Japan for a long time and having to adjust my English to a certain extent to speak to non-native English speakers like Japanese people learning English, like in the context of class. Though outside of class, I don't really speak a lot of English to Japanese people. But even so, there's lots of English speakers from other parts of the U.S., other parts of the world. I've met more of the non-American English speakers that I've met in my life have been from living in Japan, right? Having British friends, having Australian friends, having New Zealand, Kiwi friends, and Canadians and all that stuff, South Africans even, people that I never encountered in California. And I think I always describe it as my English has been rounded out. Like some of the hard edges have been sanded off. And it's not that I affect a British accent or an Australian. I certainly don't. But there's some things that I might naturally say in California that I've adjusted just to skip any potential someone going, what? Because it's happened occasionally. I'll say something and a British friend will not understand what I was saying. I can't think of any off the top of my head. But so I've sort of sanded those down. And now I speak a very generic, understandable to all speakers of English variant of the American dialect.
Same here.
It's a sort of hybrid artificial American dialect. But so when I go back to California, or even sometimes when I'm texting with my mom, sometimes I'll look back at my texts, or they've even said it to me of like, you talk a little different now. And I think it's, for example, this is a super silly, simple example, but saying like a bit, a bit, or I describe something as curious. In my family, I said that's curious, and I'd probably never in Southern California growing up there before I had lived abroad would have said curious or a bit. That's a bit curious,
right?
Not a sentence I would have said, and I try to actively like suppress it or fight it when I go back because it's the reverse thing where I feel like I just sound like this giant pompous, like. It's like I'm full of affectations and I think I'm brilliant, but it's really not what's going on. It's this other process that's happened gradually that I wasn't fully conscious of.
Oh, for sure. And also, too, I think both of our cases, teaching English over here, like we're using these textbooks that are designed for people from any English-speaking country to use. Yeah. And we're talking to people who are learning it as a second language. And we just, over time, without thinking, curate the language we use for them.
Yeah. I may have even started saying curious now that I think about it because I almost maybe back translated it from fushigi in Japanese, right?
Right.
Because there's not a perfect word for fushigi.
Yeah.
It's strange or mysterious or so. But curious, I think maybe at one point that just light bulb went off in my head. I think at some point I realized it fit in the most contexts that were the same as fushigi. And maybe I just started saying curious.
All right. So are we ready for the next topic? Do you want to?
Oh, yeah. By all means, yeah.
So then I feel like maybe we could talk about the blending of the languages for somebody. This kind of fits. This kind of fits before what we were talking about. Like parsley, for example, was a word that neither of them used.
Apologies, too, if anyone listening realizes I've gotten that story
completely wrong.
Yeah.
Same with mine. When I first came here, I was much more immersed in Japanese than I am now.
Okay.
And I think I literally spoke better Japanese 15 years ago than I speak now. Maybe that's not true, but I feel like it's true. I feel like I was much quicker to speak Japanese.
Interesting.
And a lot of Japanese seeped into my English.
Okay.
I was on the JET program. For those of you who don't know, the JET program is a government program here in Japan where they bring fresh out of college, mostly, native English speakers, mostly, to Japan, and they send them out to be the native teachers in public schools. And a lot of people on the JET program are not in cities. They're mostly out in the middle of nowhere. And so if you're ever watching on BBC or whatever, a news clip about some big festival that's happening, somewhere in Japan where, they've got some burning thing that they're all hauling through the streets or whatever, and you're watching and everybody's, they're all clad in the traditional Japanese dress. They're wearing the yukata, like the summer kimono. And you're watching, and amongst all the Japanese faces, you see this one random foreigner, this blonde, blue-eyed dude sticking out like a sore thumb. That guy's probably on the JET program. And he is like his town, like he's his town's pet gaijin.
Yeah, and they all know him.
And they all know him wherever he goes. And anyway, I was on that program. And so, but we would come together, so Nagasaki was the largest town. And Nagasaki is sort of like Montgomery, Alabama, in that it seems like it would be bigger than it is because it's famous, but it's not. It's not that big. It's a small town. Like everybody knows it, so you think it would be really big, but it's just really not.
That's a really funny observation. Yeah, that's true of a lot of places.
Yeah. So it's a small town, and like there were like two places where foreigners would gather, and one of them was the bar and the Holiday Inn.
Interesting.
And that was, and so like there were a lot of Germans there because Mitsubishi has a big footprint there, and so a lot of German engineers coming into work at Mitsubishi for a particular project or to oversee a project that Mitsubishi was doing. It's Mitsubishi Heavy Industries is the one that's there, and so there would be all these European engineers and English teachers were the people congregating in this little bar, and it was like the most boring Casablanca ever. It was. But we found that over time, our English that we were speaking to each other was peppered more and more liberally with Japanese words.
So this is including like the German engineers in it?
Even the German engineers as well. Yeah. And they were of course, more than conversant in English, but they would over time they also were using them, but it was most prominent among the English teachers that were there.
This is an interesting thing, and I'm going to confess here to having almost ideological is a strong word, but I'll call it an ideological stake in this phenomenon of blending or accidental code switching, or I don't know if there's probably a technical term for it, but where you take words that they're not originally loan words in a language that probably no native speaker would understand. You start using them interchangeably with the native, in this case you use Japanese words in English,
right,
that no one outside of that community would understand,
right.
There's probably a technical name for it, but so that's something that, of course, I've done it. I think when you first arrived today before we started recording, I couldn't find the English word for komakai.
Oh, right.
I described your coffee taste as komakai. That's something though that, like I said, I'm confessing to doing it, but what I want to be clear that I'm a bit biased here is I have like an ideological axe to grind with. I feel that, and I'm not saying for other people, mostly for myself, I feel that it's a bad habit, and I like to keep the languages as much as possible. When I'm speaking English, I'm speaking English, and when I'm speaking Japanese, I'm speaking Japanese, for no other reason than that as a discipline, I think it makes you more eloquent in the because in my case, well, I'm gonna sound like
the pompous guy you were describing earlier?
Bilingual. Oh, yeah. Okay, maybe that. Well, okay. You got me. I feel that habit is the same habit as, I can't think of exactly the word I want to say, so I'm just going to say good. You know what I mean? Where
right.
it sort of reduces your active vocabulary. And
huge.
A lot of, there you go. Huge. It's huge. A lot of my students, it's probably like an unpleasant memory for them, but I think sometimes when you're teaching kids, you have to, discipline, not in the sense of punishment, but in the sense of setting rules and expectations and enforcing them, is sometimes not a pleasant experience, but I think it's aspects of it are necessary. I was always in my class, I would always sort of nudge my kids if they used an English word in Japanese that I knew wasn't a commonly used English loan word in Japanese, or vice versa. I'd be like, which language are you speaking now? There's a Japanese word for that, or like there's an English word for that. And I would never discourage the use of one language or the other, but I was always kind of like, when you're speaking English, use English words.
Right.
And when you're speaking Japanese, speak Japanese words, because it's all well and good in that classroom, and it's all well and good in the Holiday Inn in Nagasaki to do that. But when it creeps in as like an innate habit in your English speech, and you find yourself in other situations, it can work against you. So
right.
This is something that I feel really like people ought not to. I don't advise it.
I agree, and there's
it's
levels.
Really hard to stop. Yeah.
There are levels, but it got pretty bad at one point, and I had not realized how bad it was until I went home and spoke to actual English speakers. as opposed to what I had become, and realized that like so much of my language was peppered with words that they didn't know. But I mean, one thing that is,
I just came from the Kuko.
exactly.
Where's the icky?
Yeah. I think one thing that hasn't gone away is with money, with numbers, because Japanese money is on a completely different denominational scale.
Totally.
And so
it's for some reason ichiman-en.
Yeah.
I almost never say it in English. Every time I do it, I'm like, ugh. But I'll say 6,000 yen.
Right.
Or I'll say 300,000 yen. But when I'm in the 10,000 range, I always say ichiman, niman.
Right. Well, the thing is, man is so much easier to say than 10,000.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? And because normal things that we buy regularly are in the tens of thousands.
Yeah, it's the $100 bill essentially.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so where you would say $300, here it's, I mean, either I will say it in dollars or I'll use Japanese. But I don't use I mean, it's completely blended. So I'm not going to say it's sanman. I'll say it's 3man.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
I usually say sanman. But for a while when I was trying to police myself on that and trying to break the habit, I would say like 30K, which sounded cool.
Sure. Except that if you say 30K, I assume you're talking about dollars. And I'm like, man, that is an expensive ass piece of equipment.
That's a really interesting aspect of it too, that it's bigger than just language, right? Because we all, how long have you been in Japan?
Well, almost 20 years. Well, 20 years except for one.
Okay, yeah. And I've been here 12, and I don't think I'm ever going to stop mentally going back and forth between the two monetary systems.
Right.
With like weight and temperature and stuff, I'm actually more in metric now than in imperial.
Same here.
Though not with speed, because I still, the hours I put into driving, still at this point, 98% of them were in America. So I'm still in miles per hour mentally. But when it comes to temperature...
That's true. I don't even think about it, but you're right. I wouldn't even, like, what is the legal speed in Japan? You're right.
Yeah, but when it comes to temperature, I'm way more in Celsius than I am in Fahrenheit now. When
Let's
it comes
be honest,
to my weight,
it makes more sense.
Yeah, I don't even know what my weight is in pounds without like converting it.
Oh, yeah, that's
I've been
true.
weighing myself in kilograms for years now. So but for some reason with the money, even though I guess maybe because I do have a U.S. bank account and maybe that is why. But I mean, still. The past 12 years of my life, I mean, almost all of my transactions have been with yen.
Right.
But I'm always kind of 100 yen is a dollar, give or take.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you wouldn't say, like, it's so easy to take 300 yen out and just say $3.
You're right. Yeah.
You know, how much is it? It's just $3.
Yeah. You can
but
almost,
it's not dollars at all. It's yen, and it's 300 of them.
You could even like false what's the term when there's false friends or fake loan words? You could almost merge buck and byaku. It's 3 byaku.
Yeah, right.
3 byaku in.
Actually, my favorite is the yeni.
The yeni? I've not heard that one. But
hey, do you have a yeni? Do you have 3 yeni I could borrow?
That's a good one.
Because they don't have, like, I never thought it was weird until I left my country, but the fact that our coins have names is kind of a weird thing.
Yeah. Also, do you find that, like, what is it? The quarter also now seems really strange to me because I've lived so long without it.
Right.
Where I'm like, why is there, I mean, I get that if you think of it as a quarter of a dollar,
right,
it makes sense to have.
Sure.
But when you start thinking of it as 25 cents, it's like, what's so special about the number 25 except that it's divisible?
It's a quarter of a dollar. Yeah.
Right. But because yen, there's just yen.
Right.
There's not a cent equivalent or a dollar. It's just, it's all yen.
Right.
So if you think of like 25 yen, what is the value? What is the use of a 25 yen coin? There isn't one. And for me, because I'm only counting in 5s and 1s and 10s,
right,
I can count yen coins really fast. And
right, that's true.
When I have like a quarter and some nickels and a dime and some pennies, I feel like it takes me way longer because there's like the 25.
You always have to separate the quarters out from everything else. Right. You have to separate the quarters out, and then you do them by dollars. You're like, you stack them in stacks of 4, and you're like $1, $2, $3, $4. Right. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
It is. It's weird, and it only works because we have a whole other word for our money once it's under 100.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like $1 is the baseline, and it's not And everything under that is a different word.
Even over 100, though. I mean, like I said, K.
Yeah.
You say K. And also a grand.
Grand.
That's
yeah.
one that always surprises, always Japanese people get confused.
Right.
Why is it a grand?
They're confused by the fact that we have so much slang for our money in general.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I love teaching like the shopping lessons is because like money is such an interesting, weird thing. Like American money is just so weird.
Yeah.
We have names. The dime is especially crazy because it doesn't say how much it is anywhere on it.
Oh, that's good. I've heard that before. That's very interesting.
You know what I mean? Like for a Japanese person, they're like, dime, dime.
Yeah.
Fuck's that?
Yeah, right. You can't.
And the vending machines at the airport where you like put the money in for the cart are dimes only.
Really?
Yes.
That's insane. I've never noticed
The airport where people are coming from everywhere else.
Yeah.
And it's asking you to figure out this really obscure thing.
And you're looking at it going like, how much money am I spending here?
Right. It is such a, like, it's almost like a middle finger to the whole rest of the world.
A lot of American systems feel like that.
Yeah.
A little bit, like, yeah.
How would you know what a dime was? Like, if you just see, like, dimes only, what is that?
Yeah, that's a good point. If there's no clue on the coin.
Right.
I mean, really all you can do, I guess now you could Google it.
Sure.
But
yeah, everything's a lot easier now that we have the world of information in our pocket.
Right, but pre-smartphones, you'd have to just ask someone, hey, how much? And then hope that they don't lie to you.
You're right.
You get somebody to go, oh, that's worth 1 cent.
Yeah. I remember, that's funny. When I was 19, I took my girlfriend to Vancouver up from Tacoma, and because we could drink legally there. And we were in this Jamaican restaurant. And I think the fact that we were like drinking heavily at 3 p.m. kind of cued in that we were kids coming from America. And so the waiter, this Jamaican dude, came over and he's like, hey, you guys are from America, right? Hey, I'm going to be taking a trip there later. Can we exchange some money? And I was just like, oh. And then I thought, like, wait a minute. Like, we've already changed all of our money, so we're good. Thank you. Yeah. But I was just like, oh, yeah. Like, that was my first instance of, like, somebody might be out to get me with my money if I ask a simple question about it.
Yeah. How's your danger level calibrated for travel? Because I don't trust anybody. It's not just international travel. Like if I'm even in a city I've never been to in America, I don't trust anybody to help me with that. I'm like, I'll figure it out myself.
I trust people more. It's weird. I trust people more generally in Asia than I do in America. But yeah. in Japan, I'm not really afraid somebody is going to rip me off or like steal from me.
Yeah.
But in America, it's kind of dialed up.
Okay. In Japan, I think I'm the same. But elsewhere in Asia, I don't necessarily feel the same way.
Yeah.
One time I was traveling in Korea with a friend, and he lived in Korea, but he lived in Busan, and we went to Seoul together. It was both of our first time in Seoul. We stepped off the KTX and came out of Seoul Station, and there was just a guy standing, like not near the street or where the cars were, just kind of standing near the entrance of the station going like, taxi, you did a taxi?
Right.
And my friend was like, oh, how convenient. We needed a taxi. Here's a guy offering taxis. And I was like, let's not get a taxi ride from that guy.
Yeah, right.
Because why is he standing here? Like, I don't know anything about Korea. This might be totally normal. But because I don't know anything about Korea, I'm going to just assume that
it's dodgy.
Yeah, I walk to the street and get in a taxi waiting at the street.
Right.
Yeah.
That's so funny. I also talking about profiling people. Like Japan has definitely taught me that. Like I wouldn't be this way in America. Like I'm kind of distrustful of everybody. But in Japan, like if it's a Japanese person, I'm fine. But like if a white dude wearing a tie walks up to me and just starts randomly talking to me, I'm like, are you a Mormon? Then you're up to something. Get away from me. Like if you're a Mormon and you just want to, because there's a lot of Mormons here, right?
And so also, that's not conjecture. You're definitely speaking from experience because there's a pretty good chance it's some kind of missionary.
But the thing is, if it's a Mormon, I'm fine with that. But if he's not a Mormon and he's just coming up and talking to me, then he's up to no good. That's kind of my feeling.
That's interesting. You'd prefer the missionary.
I would prefer the Mormon.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to take maybe a break?
Sure. Let's go.
Okay.
Yeah.